The morning Opal Doyle walked out of her father's house, she did not look back. Not once. Not when he shouted her name from the porch with that voice that could silence a room full of wranglers. Not when she heard the screen door slam hard enough to rattle the windows. Not when her mother's ghost seemed to whisper from every corner of the yard she had grown up in, every flower she had planted, every fence post she had helped hammer into the hard Texas earth. She did not look back, because she knew that if she did, she might lose her nerve, and she had promised herself that this time she would not lose her nerve. Her boots hit the dirt road at a hard, purposeful pace, the carpetbag in her right hand swinging with the urgency of someone who understood that every step forward was a step away from everything she had ever known. The October air carried the first serious bite of the coming winter, and the sky above the Rio Bravo Valley was the color of hammered iron, heavy and pressing, as if the whole world knew what she was doing and disapproved just as loudly as Hector Doyle. She was going to Frank Hudson. She was going to the poorest man in the valley, the man her father called a charity case, a squatter, a fool who thought he could scratch a living out of 15 acres of rocky land that nobody else wanted. Frank Hudson, who owned one mule, one milk cow, a wood stove that leaked smoke, and a cabin that sagged slightly to the left as if it were listening for something it could never quite hear. Frank Hudson, who had looked at Opal Doyle 3 months ago at the Millhaven Harvest social like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world, and had danced with her twice when her father was deep in conversation with Sheriff Galt, and had pressed his rough, calloused hand against hers at the end of the second song and said quietly, without any embellishment at all, "I think you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met in my life." Nobody had ever said that to Opal Doyle. Not like that. Not with that particular gravity and that particular honesty. The men her father had paraded before her over the years had said prettier things, slicker things. Things designed to win Hector Doyle's approval more than they were designed to win her heart. But Frank Hudson had said it the way a man says something he has been carrying for a long time and finally cannot hold any longer, and Opal had felt the truth of it land somewhere deep in her chest where things tended to stay. 3 months of stolen conversations. 3 months of notes passed through the hands of Clara Weeks at the dry goods store. 3 months of Frank appearing at the edge of the Doyle property at sunset, far enough back to be technically invisible, close enough that Opal could see the silhouette of him against the fading light and feel something in her chest rearrange itself into something that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. And then last night, Hector Doyle had come to the dinner table with a face like a closed fist and told his daughter that she was going to marry Garrett Sinclair. Not asked, told. Garrett Sinclair, who was 41 years old and already had one wife buried in the Millhaven churchyard under circumstances that people whispered about but never quite stated plainly. Garrett Sinclair, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county and who had been angling to absorb the Doyle Ranch through a marriage contract for 2 years. Garrett Sinclair, who had looked at Opal every time he came to Sunday supper with an expression that made her feel like inventory being assessed. Hector had presented this not as an opinion or a discussion, but as a fact of nature, the way he presented weather forecasts and market prices. The wedding would be in the spring. Opal would have until February to make her peace with it. Garrett was a practical choice, a strong choice, and sentiment had no place in practical decisions. Opal had sat very still through the whole of it. She had kept her face carefully neutral, the way she had learned to do over 23 years of living with a man who read emotion the way he read weakness and responded to both with pressure. She had said good night and gone to her room. She had sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time, and then she had started to pack. The road to Frank Hudson's 15 acres wound south out of Millhaven proper, past the Calhoun Mill, and then east along a creek bed that ran dry in summer and roared in spring, flanked on both sides by scrub oak and mesquite. It was 3 miles, and Opal walked all of it without stopping, the carpetbag growing heavier with each quarter mile, the cold thickening around her, her breath coming in small visible clouds that vanished into the gray morning air. She had no idea what Frank was going to say when he saw her. That was the honest truth of it, and it sat in her stomach with a weight that was not entirely comfortable. She knew what she felt. She was fairly sure she knew what he felt. But feelings and circumstances were two different territories, and the gap between them could be a canyon or a step, depending on what a person was willing to do. She came around the last bend in the creek road and Frank Hudson's property opened up before her. It was, as her father said, not much to look at by conventional measurement. The cabin sat at the near edge of the land, built solid if not elegant, the logs hand-cut and the chinking neat enough to suggest a man who cared about the details even when the details were humble. A kitchen garden, mostly harvested and turned under for winter, ran along the south wall. The mule, whose name she had learned from one of Frank's notes was Abraham, stood in a small pole corral near a lean-to shed. The milk cow was nowhere visible, probably inside the shed out of the cold. Frank was at the woodpile. He had his back to her and was splitting logs with the focused, rhythmic efficiency of a man who understood that winter did not negotiate. He was in his shirt sleeves despite the cold, and Opal could see the muscles working in his back and shoulders with each swing of the axe. He was 27 years old, lean in the way that hard work made a person lean rather than the way that poverty made a person thin, though the line between those two things on the frontier was sometimes difficult to locate. His hair was dark and needed cutting, and there was a small scar that ran through his left eyebrow that she had memorized without meaning to one evening when they stood together near the creek, and he had been explaining to her, with great earnestness and some embarrassment, why he believed his 15 acres would eventually yield something worth having. He heard her boots on the path and turned. The look on his face when he saw her standing there with her carpetbag went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, a sharp and immediate concern that furrowed the space between his brows, and then something quieter and more complex that settled behind his eyes and did not go away. He set the axe carefully against the woodpile. "Opal," he said, just her name. But the way he said it held the question and the welcome and the alarm all at once, and she was grateful for the economy of it because she was not entirely sure she could handle more than that without her composure slipping. "I left," she said. "My father told me last night that I am to marry Garrett Sinclair in the spring, and I left." He was quiet for a moment. The wind came through the scrub oaks and stirred the loose hair at her temple. "How much does he know about us?" Frank asked carefully. "He knows something," Opal said. "Clara thinks he may have intercepted one of the notes. He has not said so directly, but there was something in his voice last night that was not just about Garrett Sinclair." Frank rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. A gesture she had learned meant he was thinking hard and trying to be honest with himself about what he was thinking. He looked at her carpetbag. He looked at her face. He looked at the gray sky above the scrub oaks as if he were calculating something against it. "You cannot stay here, Opal," he said, and before the cold spike of that could fully reach her, he continued, "Not like this, not without everything being made proper between us first, because if your father comes here and finds you here without that, he will have grounds to make this into something ugly and public in a way that hurts you more than it hurts either of us." She stared at him. "What are you suggesting?" Frank Hudson looked at her with that steady, undecorated honesty that she had come to understand was the most fundamental thing about him, the quality that ran through everything he did the way a seam of good rock ran through unreliable ground. "I am suggesting," he said, "that you marry me instead. Today, if Reverend Calloway is willing to open the church on short notice. And then your father can shout about it all he wants, but the thing will be done and legal, and there will not be a thing in the world he can do to undo it." Opal Doyle looked at Frank Hudson for a long time. The cold air moved between them. Abraham the mule shifted in his corral with a sound of contentment that was entirely inappropriate to the gravity of the moment. "Frank Hudson," she said at last, "that is either the bravest or the most reckless thing I have ever heard." "Most likely both," he agreed. She set her carpetbag down on the frost-stiffened grass. "Then let us go find Reverend Calloway," she said. They went, and that was how it started. But to understand how it ended, and how Hector Doyle came around before the first serious snow of that winter settled on the Rio Bravo Valley, you had to understand what came before the morning on the creek road. You had to understand the 3 months that preceded it, and the summer before that, and the particular architecture of secrets and silence and stubborn love that had been building since the August afternoon when Opal Doyle had first seen Frank Hudson clearly and understood, with the certainty of a woman who did not fool herself about important things, that she was in serious trouble. The harvest social at the Millhaven Community Hall had been held in late September, as it always was, in the long building behind the Baptist church, where the community gathered for the things that required gathering. It was 1884 in the Rio Bravo Valley of West Texas, a year of middling rains and reasonable cattle prices, and the social had been well attended because the summer had been hard enough that people were genuinely grateful for the harvest and looking for reasons to express it. Opal had come with her father and the 2 ranch hands he kept near him at public events, not because he feared trouble exactly, but because Hector Doyle was a man who understood the language of visible authority and chose to speak it at all times. Hector was 56 that year, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something that resembled distinction if you did not look too closely at the coldness behind the eyes. He had built the Doyle Ranch from almost nothing 25 years earlier, had survived a Comanche raid that killed 2 of his original hands, had outlasted 3 bad droughts, and had buried his wife Margaret 8 years ago with a grief that had, Opal sometimes thought, calcified into something harder and less flexible than grief was supposed to become over time. He loved his daughter. She did not doubt that. But love, in Hector Doyle's understanding of the world, was expressed through provision and protection and the arrangement of circumstances, not through the softer currencies of acknowledgement and tenderness. He had kept Opal educated, well-clothed, well-fed, and firmly inside the boundaries of what he considered appropriate for a woman of her station in the valley. He had done all of this with genuine devotion, and absolutely no awareness that the person he was doing it for had a rich interior life that his arrangements could not touch. Opal had been at the harvest social for perhaps 40 minutes, standing near the refreshment table with her friend Clara Weeks, and trying to find something interesting in a conversation that had drifted to new curtain fabric when she noticed Frank Hudson. He was standing near the far wall by himself, which was not unusual for Frank Hudson, she would learn. He was holding a tin cup of cider with the air of a man who had come mostly for the cider, and was finding the rest of the event optional. He was dressed in clean clothes that were plain and carefully mended, and he looked mildly out of place in the way that people looked out of place when they could not afford to perform belonging the way everyone around them was performing it, but who had too much internal dignity to apologize for that fact. What had caught her attention first was not his looks, though she registered those in the way a person registered them when they were looking at someone for the first time without filters. What caught her attention was that he was the only person in the room who was not, on some level, managing his presentation. Everyone else was doing something with their face or their posture or their voice that was at least partially about how they were being perceived. Frank Hudson was just standing there, entirely present in himself, watching the fiddler with genuine, uncomplicated pleasure. Clara had noticed her noticing and said, with the particular sharpness of a good friend, "That is Frank Hudson. He has the rocky 15 acres south of the Calhoun Mill. Everyone says he is wasting his time out there, but he has been at it 2 years now and the place is standing. Who does he belong to?" Opal had asked, meaning in the social sense of the question, family connections, history, the lattice of relationships that defined a person's position in a small community. "Nobody much," Clara said. "He came from somewhere east Missouri, I think, after the war left his family's land and estate. He does not talk about it a great deal. He is steady and honest and everyone respects him, but nobody particularly thinks about him unless they need a fence post set properly. Opal had thought about that for a moment. And then the fiddler had started a reel and the dancing had begun, and the evening had proceeded, and that might have been the end of it except that half an hour later, while her father was deep in conversation with Sheriff Galt and two of the Calhoun brothers about water rights, Frank Hudson had appeared at her elbow. "Would you care to dance?" he had asked, not with any performance of confidence, not with the slick, easy manner of men who asked this question many times and had rehearsed the asking. He had asked it the way he said everything she would eventually come to know he said, simply and directly, as if the question were important enough to deserve honest delivery. She had said yes. And they had danced, and in the dancing she had discovered that he was attentive in a way that was rare, that he listened when she spoke and did not glance away to survey the room while she was talking, and that when he laughed at something she said it was genuine rather than performed. They had danced twice, and in the second dance she had felt the calluses on his hand against hers, and for some reason that had mattered more than any smooth hand she had ever been offered. At the end of the second song he had told her she was remarkable, and she had gone home carrying that word the way you carried something fragile. She had not told her father. That was the first secret. The second secret was harder to maintain. Over the weeks that followed, she and Frank had found ways to exist in each other's proximity that were technically within the rules her father's household operated by while being clearly and deliberately outside the spirit of those rules. The dry goods store on Tuesday mornings, when her father was occupied with his weekly meeting with his foreman Denny Marsh about the coming week's work on the ranch. The church social committee, which Opal joined in October and which met in the evenings, providing 2 hours of latitude per week that she used more creatively than the social committee required. The creek wrote itself on the rare Saturday afternoons when she could manufacture an errand that took her in that direction. Frank was always careful, more careful than she was, she sometimes thought, because his caution came from a different place than hers. Her caution was about avoiding her father's anger. His caution was about protecting her from consequences he could see more clearly than she wanted to. He knew that Hector Doyle's disapproval was not merely a personal inconvenience, but a force with practical weight in the valley, that a word from Hector to the right people could make Frank's already difficult situation significantly worse, could poison his relationships with the few suppliers who extended him credit, could complicate the water access he needed for his small operation. He knew all of this and he came anyway, to the edge of things, careful and steady and there. What Frank never spoke about during those months, and what Opal pieced together gradually from small observations and the occasional unguarded moment, was the dark past that he carried the way all people carry things that have fundamentally altered the shape of them. He had come from Missouri in 1882, 2 years before the harvest social, having sold what remained of a family farm that had been steadily losing ground since the war years of the 1860s. His father had been a Union man in a divided county, and the social costs of that position had been long and grinding, quieter than violence but in some ways more exhaustive. By the time Frank's father died in 1880, the land was mortgaged past recovery, and Frank had spent 2 years trying to claw it back before accepting the truth of the situation and moving on. He had chosen West Texas because land was still cheap there, and the possibilities were still theoretical enough to sustain the kind of hope that practical men needed in order to keep functioning. He had found the 15 acres nobody wanted because the soil was rocky and the terrain was awkward, and made an offer that the previous owner, a man leaving for California, had accepted with an expression of mild guilt. He had spent the first winter in a temporary shelter that was closer to a dugout than a cabin, and had built the actual cabin in the spring of 1883 with lumber. He hauled himself from the Calhoun mill, and help from exactly 2 neighbors who had seen in him the quality of a man worth helping. What he did not tell Opal, until much later, was the specific nature of the thing that had happened in Missouri that had accelerated his departure beyond the slow pressure of financial failure. There had been a woman, not a romance exactly, more a misunderstanding of mutual feelings that had been interpreted by her family as an impropriety, and had created a situation that made remaining in that community not just uncomfortable but genuinely inadvisable. Nothing criminal, nothing cruel, merely the kind of thing that happens when two young people are not honest enough with each other about what they want, and a protective family draws conclusions and demands remedies. He had left cleanly and without incident, but the experience had left him with a particular sensitivity to the danger of unclear intentions and a particular commitment to honesty that sometimes made him seem blunt to people who did not understand where the bluntness came from. When he looked at Opal Doyle, he saw someone whose situation required that honesty even more than most situations required it. He was not going to be the man who created a beautiful ambiguity that left her holding consequences he had escaped. If he was going to be in her life, it was going to be in a way that was clear and real and protective of her, or it was not going to be at all. That was the foundation of the proposal he made on the frost-stiffened grass outside his cabin on that cold October morning. Not impulse, not rashness, careful, specific, honest intention. Reverend Calloway, who was a practical man of faith with long experience of the West Texas frontier, listened to their request with an expression that passed through several phases of pastoral concern before settling on something resembling resigned acceptance of the particular mystery of human hearts. "Your father does not know about this," he asked Opal carefully. "He does not," she said. "And I want you to understand that I am 23 years old, Reverend, and I am making this decision with full understanding of what I am doing. Your father is a significant member of this congregation, Opal." "My father is a man who wants to sell me to Garrett Sinclair," she said, without heat or drama, just the flat truth of it laid down like a card. "And I am respectfully asking you to help me choose something different." Calloway looked at Frank. "And you understand what you are taking on. The difficulty of your circumstances is not going to be made easier by this." Frank met the Reverend's eyes steadily. "I understand it completely. And I want to be clear that Opal is not coming to a man who expects her to apologize for having more than he does. I know what I have and what I do not have. I have a plan for the land and I have the will to work it, and I will do everything in my power to build something worthy of her. But I am not going to let her be handed off to a man she does not want because her father thinks wealth is an adequate substitute for choice." There was a long silence in the small anteroom of the Baptist church. "I will need 2 witnesses," Calloway said finally. Clara Weeks, when she received the request, arrived at the church within 20 minutes with her husband Thomas, and an expression that mixed delight and terror in a proportion that Opal found deeply endearing. Thomas Weeks, who was a quiet and decent man who kept his own counsel about other people's business, signed the register without editorial comment and shook Frank's hand afterward with something that approached warmth. The ceremony was short and simple. Reverend Calloway conducted it with dignity and without unnecessary embellishment. Opal wore her everyday dress and no flowers and her hair the way she had it when she walked out of her father's house that morning. Frank wore the cleanest shirt he owned. They said the words clearly and without hesitation, and Reverend Calloway pronounced them married in the eyes of God and the state of Texas, and recorded it in the church register in his careful, deliberate handwriting. Opal Doyle became Opal Hudson at 11:45 in the morning of October the 14th, 1884. Clara embraced her and wept in the straightforward way of a good friend for whom other people's happiness was genuinely good news. Thomas shook Frank's hand again and said he hoped for fair weather for them, which was the kind of thing Thomas said when he meant something more specific and personal than weather. They walked back to the cabin on the creek road in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Opal had not yet fully processed the weight of what had just happened, but she was aware of a feeling that she could only describe as landing, the sensation of a thing that has been in motion for a long time finally finding its ground. Frank made coffee on the wood stove. They sat at the rough table he had made himself, in the 2 chairs he had made himself, in the cabin he had built himself, and drank the coffee and looked at each other across the table with the particular expression of 2 people who have just done something enormous and are only beginning to understand the dimensions of it. "He is going to come," Frank said. "Yes," Opal agreed. "He is going to come today." "Are you ready for that?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said, "but I am not going to be more ready tomorrow or next week, so today will have to do." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and that felt more real than most things that had happened to her in the previous 24 hours. Hector Doyle arrived at 3 in the afternoon. He did not come alone. He brought Denny Marsh, his foreman, a heavy, silent man with a face like a granite shelf, and he brought the ranch hand called Pete Rays, who was young and loyal and generally went where Hector pointed him. They came on horseback at a pace that announced intention, and Opal, who had been watching the creek road from the cabin window for the better part of an hour, saw them coming while they were still a quarter-mile out. "He is here," she said. Frank stood up from the bench where he had been working on a piece of harness leather that needed repair. He set the work down and straightened his back and went to the door and opened it and stood there, calm in the way of a man who has made his peace with what is coming, not because it is going to be pleasant, but because it is inevitable, and meeting inevitable things with your shoulders back costs no more than meeting them hunched. Hector pulled his horse up 10 feet from the cabin door and looked at Frank Hudson, and then at his daughter, who had come to stand beside Frank in the doorway, with an expression that was more complicated than simple anger, though anger was clearly present. There was something beneath the anger that looked like pain, and Opal recognized it because she knew her father's face better than he knew it himself, and she understood that his pain and his pride were the same thing wearing different hats. "Opal," he said, "come away from there." "No," she said. Her voice was even. She had decided the night before, lying sleepless in her childhood room, that she would not shout and she would not weep, and she would not fall into the old patterns of their arguments where his volume became the weather and she navigated within it. She was going to be clear and still and honest. "I am not going to do that, Papa." Hector's jaw tightened. He shifted his gaze to Frank with the look of a man sighting something down a rifle barrel. "You have 20 seconds to explain yourself, Hudson." "We were married this morning at the Baptist church," Frank said. "Reverend Calloway officiated. Clara and Thomas Weeks witnessed it. It is recorded in the church register, and we will file with the county clerk tomorrow. Opal came to me of her own free will and made her own decision, and I honored that by making everything legal and proper rather than allowing any other arrangement. The silence that followed this was the kind of silence that had weather in it." Hector's face went through a series of expressions that Opal watched with the careful attention of someone watching a fire to understand which way it was going to spread. Fury came first, and it was real and it was large. But beneath the fury she saw something she had not expected to see, not quite so plainly anyway. A calculation, a man taking inventory of what had actually happened, and what the available responses to it were. "You have nothing," Hector said to Frank, and the contempt in his voice was real, but it was also, she thought, partly a probe looking for the crack where it might enter and do damage. "That is mostly true," Frank said without flinching. "I have 15 acres of rocky land that I believe in. I have a plan and the hands to work it. And I have your daughter, who came to me because she chose to, and I am going to spend the rest of my life being grateful for that and worthy of it." "Worthy of it." Hector repeated the phrase with a kind of bitter incredulity. "You are going to keep my daughter in a cabin that lists to one side with 1 mule and a cow and call that worthy?" "I am going to work every day to give her better than that," Frank said. "I cannot promise you a timeline that satisfies your expectations, and I am not going to lie to you to make you feel better about it." What I can promise you is that she will be safe and cared for and that her choices will be respected in this house." Something moved in Hector's expression. It was very brief and Opal was not entirely sure she had seen it. But there had been a flicker of something when Frank said the word respected, as if the word had touched something that Hector Doyle was not prepared to be touched by in this moment. "Denny," Hector said to his foreman, not taking his eyes off Frank, "take note of all this." "Yes, sir," Denny Marsh said from behind Hector's shoulder in the tone of a man noting things. "If you want to speak to me about this further," Hector said to Frank, "you know where to find me." He said it in the tone of a man issuing an invitation that was also a challenge. Then he looked at Opal one more time, and for a single unguarded moment his face was just her father's face, the face she had known her whole life, the face that had been frightening and safe at different times and sometimes both at once. "You have made your bed," he said. "I have," she agreed, "and I am at peace with it." He turned his horse. Denny and Pete turned theirs. They rode back up the creek road at the same purposeful pace they had arrived at, and the hoofbeats faded into the cold afternoon air, and Opal stood in the doorway of her husband's cabin and let out a breath that she felt she had been holding since the previous evening. Frank put his hand on her shoulder, just that, just the warmth of it, the steadiness. "He will come back," she said. "He is not finished." "No," Frank agreed. "He is not finished, but neither are we." The first weeks of their marriage were a kind of compressed education in the life Frank Hudson was living, and the life they were now building together. Opal had not been raised to be idle. The Doyle household was a working household and Hector had never believed in ornamental women. But the scale and the resource level of Frank's 15 acres required a different order of ingenuity and labor than anything she had done before. The cabin was functional, and she learned its rhythms quickly. The wood stove needed particular management to draw properly, and she spent 2 mornings learning the specific combination of damper position and kindling arrangement that produced heat without excessive smoke. The kitchen garden had been Frank's, and it was good, but it was sized for 1 person, and they spent a Saturday afternoon planning what it would need to be for 2 and writing a list of seeds to acquire before spring. Frank was at work before dawn every day. The 15 acres were rocky, as everyone said, but he had been systematically working to clear one section at a time, pulling stones by hand and by mule team, turning the soil under, building it up with manure and the composted material he had been accumulating. It was slow work and it was relentless work, and Opal watched him doing it with a combination of admiration and something that was close to awe, not at the heroics of it. There was nothing heroic about pulling rocks out of frozen ground in the pre-dawn dark, but at the sheer, committed dailiness of it. He was not building his future in dramatic gestures. He was building it in accumulated mornings. She began to help in the specific ways she could, and the ways multiplied as she understood the operation better. She had a head for numbers that Frank respected without false modesty about his own, which were not bad but were slower, and she took over the record-keeping that he had been doing in a small notebook with varying degrees of accuracy. She found that his credit arrangements with the Millhaven suppliers were in slightly worse shape than he had known, partly because he had not been tracking them with enough precision, and she spent a careful afternoon doing the mathematics and presenting him with a picture that was sobering but not catastrophic, and that had a recoverable path through it if they were careful for the next 6 months. "You are very good at this," he said, looking at the numbers she had laid out. "My father taught me," she said, and there was nothing complicated in how she said it. It was simply true. Frank looked at her. "He is a capable man," he said carefully. "I want to be clear that my difficulties with him are about what he was doing with you, not with who he is generally." "I know that," she said, "and I think he knows it too, somewhere underneath the anger. He is not a man who respects people he does not believe deserve it, and he does not fight with people he does not take seriously. Is that supposed to make me feel better?" Frank asked with the small, dry edge of humor that she had learned to look for and always enjoyed when she found it. "Marginally," she said, and they both laughed, And that laughter in that small cabin with the wood stove pulling properly and the account book open on the table was one of the most purely pleasant moments Opal could remember. They were finding, in those first weeks, that they were well suited to each other in ways that went beyond feeling. Their temperaments complemented rather than collided. He was deliberate where she was quick, and she was quick in ways that caught things he missed, and he was deliberate in ways that prevented her quickness from becoming carelessness. He talked more than he had seemed to at the social events where she had first known him, once the constraint of careful presentation was removed, and what he talked about was interesting. He had read widely and thought carefully about what he read and had opinions that he held firmly, but revised willingly when presented with better information. She loved him. She had known she loved him before the marriage, had known it the way you knew things you had been afraid to look at directly, and now that she had looked at it directly, it was even larger and more complete than she had expected. Not the breathless, destabilizing variety of love that novels described and that she suspected was mostly anxiety wearing romantic clothing, but a deep, rooted, consequential love, the kind that made a person want to do better and be more honest and show up fully. She told him so on a Thursday evening in late October when they were sitting by the stove after supper and the wind was doing something serious outside. "I love you," she said. Not for the first time, they had said it before, but in this particular moment, in the particular warmth of that particular evening, she said it with an intention that was different from the previous times. "I want you to know that it is not gratitude and it is not the romance of having done something bold. It is just the plain truth of what I feel when I look at you." Frank set down the book he had been reading. He looked at her with that look she had come to know as his most real look, the one he kept back until he was sure he wanted to use it. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since the night of the harvest social. I did not say anything about it for a month after that because I was trying to be honest with myself about whether it was something real or something I was manufacturing out of loneliness. I decided it was real when I realized I was not thinking about the idea of you, but about you specifically, about the particular way you think, and the things that make you laugh, and the way you said something at the church social in October that was the most precisely honest thing I had heard anyone say in a year. I love you in a way that is not going to get smaller with familiarity. I expect it is going to get considerably larger." She crossed the room and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and outside the wind did whatever it wanted, and inside the stove was warm, and that was enough. Meanwhile, the situation with Hector Doyle was not standing still. Hector Doyle did not visit again in October. He did not send word. He did not appear on the creek road or at the church or at any of the neutral spaces where such meetings could theoretically occur. Clara Weeks, who was Opal's primary connection to the wider world of Millhaven during those first weeks, reported that Hector had told Garrett Sinclair about the marriage, and that Garrett had received the news with a coldness that was more frightening than visible anger, because it was harder to read and impossible to predict. Garrett Sinclair is a man with a long memory and a short tolerance for being made to look foolish, Clara said, on one of her Tuesday visits to the cabin that had become a weekly ritual Opal relied on greatly. He had told people there was an understanding between him and your father about this. He had said it publicly, at the Calhoun supper, not as a brag exactly, but as a statement of expectation. So now he looks like a man whose expectation was publicly overturned. "What does he intend to do about it?" Opal asked. Clara hesitated in the way of someone choosing how much of what they know to say. "There is some talk about him approaching the county clerk's office about whether the marriage was properly registered, whether there was any irregularity in the procedure." Opal felt a spike of cold alarm. There was nothing irregular about it. "No," Clara agreed. "I was there, and Tom was there, and Reverend Calloway performed it correctly, and it was registered properly. But a man like Garrett Sinclair, with his resources, can make a challenge that is ultimately unsuccessful, but that is nevertheless unpleasant and lengthy and damaging in the doing of it. Opal told Frank that evening, presenting the information directly and without the impulse to soften it that she sometimes had to resist when she felt him take on weight he was already carrying a great deal of. Frank listened without interruption. Then he said, "I will go and speak to Reverend Calloway tomorrow and ask him to write out a formal declaration of the ceremony's conduct and have it notarized. And I will speak to Tom Weeks and ask him to do the same. If Sinclair wants to challenge this, let him challenge it against a complete record." "That is good," she said. "There is also something else." He waited. "Clara says there is talk among some of your suppliers. The hardware store on 2nd Street, Callahan's. There is a suggestion that your account there is being discussed in terms of risk. Clara's husband hears things because he keeps the books for 3 of the businesses on that street, and apparently someone has been making inquiries about your credit standing." Frank was very still for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Sinclair." "Or my father," Opal said. "Or both." The possibility that her father might be an active participant in a campaign to financially pressure Frank was something she had to look at honestly, and she did, because she had promised herself honesty even when it was uncomfortable. Hector Doyle was a man who solved problems through available pressure, and financial pressure was one of his most reliable tools. But she also knew her father well enough to believe that direct economic sabotage against a man who had done nothing legally wrong would sit uneasily with the particular code he lived by, which was not always a kind code, but was a consistent one. As it turned out, the credit concern was Sinclair's doing rather than Hector's, a fact that would become relevant later in a way that neither Opal nor Frank could have predicted in October. For now, they dealt with it the way they dealt with everything, practically together, without wasted panic. Frank made visits to each of the suppliers he owed money to and had straightforward conversations about his accounts and his plans and his current capacity to pay. He made partial payments on 2 of the accounts out of the small reserve he had kept against emergencies, reducing the outstanding balances to levels that were easier for the suppliers to carry without anxiety. He did this without Opal's suggestion, though she had been thinking along the same lines, and she found that the parallel thought was pleasing in the way that discovering you are reading the same book as someone you care about is pleasing. November arrived with a cold front that stripped the last of the leaves off the scrub oaks and put a layer of frost on the creek each morning that did not always fully thaw by midday. The kitchen garden was done and put to bed under straw. Abraham had been moved into the shed full-time. Frank had finished the most critical section of stone clearing and had turned the soil under in preparation for spring planting, and the cleared ground, even in its winter bareness, looked like potential rather than failure. They had settled into a domestic rhythm that had the quality of something that had always been there rather than something newly constructed. Opal cooked with the ingredients available to them, which required creativity and produced results that surprised her sometimes. Frank fixed the thing on the stove that leaked smoke, and the satisfaction he took in solving it was so unaffected and genuine that she sat watching him do it with a warmth in her chest that she thought she might want to feel for the rest of her life. There were hard moments. The money was real, the tightness of it, the constant calculation of what was possible and what was not. There were evenings when the cold got into the cabin despite Frank's best efforts at the chinking, and they sat closer to the stove than was entirely comfortable, and both of them knew what they were not saying, which was that this was genuinely difficult and was going to continue to be difficult for some time. But they talked about everything. That was the thing that Opal found she had not expected, and that she valued above almost everything else about her marriage, the talking. Frank Hudson was a man who believed that silence was for sleeping and for reverence, and that most other situations were improved by honest speech. He talked to her about his plans for the land and his doubts about his plans for the land. He talked about what he had learned from the 2 years before she came and what he wished he had done differently. He talked about Missouri and his father and the farm that had not made it, not bitterly, just as information about where he had come from and what he had learned from it. She talked back. She told him things she had not told anyone, the specific texture of her childhood with her father, which had not been unhappy exactly, but had been constrained in a way that had produced in her a hunger for expansion, for more room to be fully herself than the Doyle household's expectations had allowed. She told him about her mother Margaret, who had been a woman of genuine warmth and quick intelligence, who had managed the ranch's accounts in the early years, and had been essential to its success in ways that Hector acknowledged privately but rarely publicly. She had died of a fever in the summer of 1876, when Opal was 15, and the loss had been enormous in the immediate sense, and had continued to be enormous in the slow, ongoing way of absences that reshape everything around them. She told Frank that she thought her father's insistence on controlling her future was in some ways a kind of grief response, that he had lost the one person he trusted completely, and had responded by tightening his grip on the one other person he cared about, as if grip could substitute for the trust he did not know how to rebuild. This did not excuse it, she said carefully, but it explained something. Frank listened to all of this with the full attention she had learned to rely on, and at the end of it he said, "Do you want to repair the relationship with him?" She thought about that for a long time. "Yes," she said, "not the way it was, but something real. Something that has room for both of us in it." "Then we should find a way to make that possible," Frank said. "Not by giving ground on what we have decided, but by leaving the door open." The opening of that door came, as it turned out, not from Opal or Frank directly but from Garrett Sinclair's own actions, which had the particular quality of villainous overreach that tends to produce consequences its originator did not intend. In the second week of November, Garrett Sinclair made a formal complaint to the county clerk's office in the town of Marfa, which was the county seat, alleging irregularities in the registration of the Hudson marriage. He did this through a lawyer he brought up from El Paso, a man named Welliver who wore an expensive suit and had an expression of permanent disappointed superiority. The complaint was thin, and Welliver knew it was thin and had presumably told Sinclair it was thin, but Sinclair had paid for the effort and the effort was made. The complaint came to the attention of the community of Millhaven within 24 hours, because communities of that size and that period transmitted information with the speed of weather, and within 48 hours it had produced a reaction that Garrett Sinclair had not adequately modeled in his calculations. The reaction was that people were annoyed. Not all people, and not with uniform intensity, but a significant number of the people of Millhaven, who had never had strong feelings about Frank Hudson one way or another, found that they had surprisingly strong feelings about a man with Sinclair's resources using those resources to attack a marriage that had been conducted properly and legally between two adults. It touched something that people in that community, who lived on the unpredictable edge of frontier life, felt instinctively about the sanctity of a legal contract properly made. It was the kind of overreach that invited resistance. Reverend Calloway delivered a notably pointed sermon the following Sunday about the sanctity of marriage covenants and the impropriety of legal challenges against them by parties who were not within the marriage itself. He did not name Sinclair. He did not need to. Thomas Weeks, who was in fact a careful and precise keeper of records, provided a notarized written account of the marriage ceremony that was so thorough and so professionally executed that the lawyer Welliver, upon reviewing it, reportedly told Sinclair that the complaint had no viable path forward, and that continuing to pursue it would only increase the damage to Sinclair's own standing in the community. The complaint was withdrawn within a week, but the more significant consequence of Sinclair's action was what it produced in Hector Doyle. Hector had known about the complaint before it was filed. He had not been its originator, but Sinclair had informed him of it as a courtesy, or perhaps as an invitation to participate, and Hector had said nothing to discourage it, which was not the same as endorsing it but was not entirely separate from it either. He had held his silence on the matter and watched it proceed. When the complaint was withdrawn, and the reason for its withdrawal became clear, when he understood that the marriage was as solid legally as it was possible to be, and that the community's response to Sinclair's challenge had been largely sympathetic to Frank and Opal, Hector Doyle sat alone in his office on a Wednesday evening in November and did something he had not done in a very long time. He thought carefully about whether he was wrong. Hector Doyle was not a man who performed this exercise frequently. His strength, and what he understood as his strength, was decisiveness, the ability to make a judgment and hold to it against resistance. This quality had served him well in many situations and had cost him severely in others, and the cost had most often fallen not on him, but on the people in his immediate orbit. Margaret had paid that cost. He had known that even while she was alive, had known it in the particular way that people know things they have not yet decided to fully accept. He had been making his daughter pay it since her mother's death, tightening the control that he told himself was protection, because the distinction between those two things had become confused in him over years of unexamined grief. The man who had faced him on the creek road, calm and honest and entirely undeflected by Hector's contempt, had said the word respected. Opal's choices will be respected in this house. Hector had been carrying that word around for 3 weeks without acknowledging that he was carrying it. On this Wednesday evening, he took it out and looked at it. Frank Hudson had taken nothing from Hector Doyle. He had not seduced or manipulated or used Opal as a means to some other end. He had, by every account Hector had been able to gather, and he had gathered accounts carefully without showing that he was doing so, conducted himself with complete propriety and documented honesty throughout the matter. He had gone to the church before he accepted Opal into his home because he wanted it done properly. He had faced Hector's anger without a weapon and without retreat. He had paid down his supplier accounts under financial pressure without complaint. He had not, as far as Hector could determine, spoken ill of Hector to anyone. What Hector had told himself about Frank Hudson, the poverty, the failure, the worthlessness, was a story he had built quickly out of the parts that suited his conclusion. The fuller picture, assembled from the less partial information now available to him, was of a man who had come from legitimate difficulty, had applied himself seriously to a genuine plan, and who had treated Hector's daughter with a care and respect that Garrett Sinclair, for all his cattle and his land, had never once demonstrated in his dealings with the people around him. Hector was a man who, beneath the hardness, had a code. It was a rigid and sometimes unkind code, but it was real and he had lived by it through genuinely hard circumstances, and part of that code was the acknowledgement, when it was unavoidable, of a truth that contradicted what you wanted to believe. He sent Denny Marsh to the cabin on the creek road on a Thursday morning with a message, which was that Hector Doyle would like to call upon his daughter, if she was willing, at a time of her choosing, without his foreman or his ranch hands in attendance. Opal received the message and sat with it for a long time before responding. Frank said only that it was her decision, and that he would support whatever she decided, and that his door, which was now also her door, was open if her father chose to walk through it. He said this without difficulty and without performance, which she recognized as a significant thing. She sent word back with Denny that her father was welcome to visit on Saturday afternoon. Hector came on Saturday at 2 in the afternoon, alone and on foot, having tied his horse at the beginning of the creek road path and walked the last quarter-mile. Opal saw him coming through the window, and the sight of her father, Hector Doyle, who had always ridden everywhere, walking alone along the path through the scrub oaks, did something to her chest that she had not anticipated. Frank was at the wood pile when Hector came into the clearing. He set the axe down and straightened and nodded, and Hector nodded back, and the two men looked at each other across the yard with the expression of men who had not figured out what they were going to be to each other yet but were present for the process of figuring it out. "Hudson," Hector said, "Mr. Doyle," Frank said, "Opal is inside. I will leave you two to it." "Stay," Hector said. The word was clipped, almost inaudible. "There are things I should say to you as well." Frank stayed. Opal came out of the cabin and stood in the yard and looked at her father, and her father looked at her, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "You look well," Hector said finally. He said it the way a man said something true when he had expected to find something different, and the truth was somewhat inconvenient. "I am well, Papa," she said. "Come inside and have coffee." They went inside. Frank put more wood on the stove and made coffee with the economical precision of a man used to stretching a finite supply of things, and Hector sat at the rough table and looked around the cabin with an expression that Opal watched carefully. He was taking inventory. She could see him doing it. The practical man in him was counting the quality of the construction, the adequacy of the ceiling against cold, the function of the stove, the organization of the tools on their hooks, the account book on the shelf. He was reading the place the way he read everything, through the lens of what it told him about the man who had built it. What the cabin told him, she knew, was that Frank Hudson lived with care and intention inside his limited means, that nothing was wasted and nothing was neglected, and that the limitations were real but the approach to them was serious and competent. Frank set coffee on the table and sat down, and the three of them were around the table together for the first time, and there was a heaviness to it that was not hostility exactly, but was the weight of everything that had not yet been said. Hector wrapped his hands around the tin cup and looked at Frank directly. "I behaved badly toward you," he said. The words came out flat and deliberate, as if they had been assembled carefully and were being delivered before the assembly could be second-guessed. "I came to your property with men behind me, and I spoke to you in a way that was designed to diminish you rather than to discover what kind of man you actually were. That was not the conduct I would claim for myself." Frank received this without visible surprise, though Opal suspected he had not expected it. "I understand the position you were in," he said, "and I want you to know that there was nothing in your reaction that I thought was unreasonable given what you believed about the situation." "What I believed was shaped by what I wanted to believe," Hector said, with a bluntness that sounded almost involuntary. "I am an old man who thought he knew what was best for his daughter, without having asked his daughter what she thought was best for herself." He looked at Opal then, and the expression on his face was something she had to work to look at directly because it was her father without the armor, and she had not seen that version in a very long time. "I am sorry, Opal, for the Sinclair business and for not listening, and for making you feel that running was the only option you had." Opal Doyle, who had not cried since the night she sat in the dark on the edge of her childhood bed deciding to pack, felt her eyes sting. She held her composure, but just barely. "I want you to know him, Papa," she said. "Really know him, not the version you built in your mind." Hector looked at Frank again. There was a long pause. "Tell me about the 15 acres, Hector said. Frank paused slightly in surprise, and then he began to talk about the land. He talked about the stone clearing and the soil composition, and the section he had been working toward that, once cleared, would give him genuinely good growing ground because the drainage was right and the sun exposure was favorable. He talked about his plan for a second well. He talked about the possibility, still theoretical, of a small dairy operation centered on the milk cow, which was a good producer, and expanding that with a second animal if the economics permitted. Hector listened. And as Frank talked, Opal watched her father doing something she had seen him do very rarely. He was updating his opinion in real time. She could see it happening, the small adjustments in his expression as a piece of Frank's thinking connected to something Hector's own experience recognized as sound. Hector Doyle understood land, and he understood hard work, and he understood the particular species of intelligent stubbornness required to believe in a difficult piece of ground when everything around you was telling you to give up. He had been that man 30 years ago. He had forgotten that he had been that man. They talked for 2 hours. At some point, The conversation stopped being about the 15 acres specifically, and became about farming and ranching and water management in West Texas more generally. And Hector said several things that were genuinely useful that Frank received with the honesty of a man who was not too proud to learn from someone who knew more than him about a particular subject, even if that subject was his father-in-law. When Hector finally stood to leave, the light was failing and the temperature was dropping with the particular efficiency of a November evening in that country. He put on his coat and stood at the door and looked at the two of them. "I will not pretend," he said, "that this is what I would have chosen, but I am beginning to understand that what a man would have chosen and what is actually right are not always the same territory." He looked at Frank. "I want to come back and see the land, the cleared section you were describing." "Anytime you want to see it," Frank said. "You are always welcome here." Hector nodded. He looked at Opal, and the look said things that he had not found words for yet and might not for some time. But they were real things and she understood them. He walked back up the creek road in the failing light, and Opal and Frank stood in the doorway and watched him go, and the cold air came around them, and Frank put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him. "He came," she said. "He came," Frank agreed. "I did not think he would, not this quickly." "He is a man who knows how to do hard things," Frank said quietly. "Acknowledging that you are wrong is one of the hardest things there is. He did not do it halfway." She turned and looked up at him. "Are you saying something good about my father?" "I am acknowledging a man's quality where it exists," Frank said, with the small edge of humor she loved. "I am not required to agree with everything he has ever done in order to see what he actually is." She kissed him. Right there in the doorway of the cabin that listed slightly to the left, with the cold coming in around them and the light fading over the scrub oaks, she kissed her husband and felt the warmth of him and the certainty of him, and thought that this was the specific shape of the life she had chosen, and she wanted every inch of it. The weeks that followed Hector's visit had a quality of something gently opening, like ground thawing after a frost, slow and not quite linear but unmistakable in its direction. Hector came back the following Thursday to see the cleared land, as he had said he would, and he and Frank walked the 15 acres in the cold November air, and Hector asked questions and Frank answered them, and they were two men talking about land in the way that men who understood land talked about it, which was its own language with its own respect embedded in it. Hector said, at one point looking at the cleared section, "You have done this without a proper breaking plow." "I have," Frank said. Hector was quiet for a moment. "I have a spring-tooth harrow sitting in my equipment shed that I replaced 2 years ago when I bought a new one. It works, it just is not the new model. You can have it if you want to come and collect it." Frank looked at Hector Doyle with an expression that was careful and genuine. "That is generous," he said. "I will take care of it." "I expect you will," Hector said, in a tone that was not quite warmth but was something adjacent to it, the sound of a man who had revised his estimate upward and was acknowledging it in the way that he acknowledged things, obliquely and practically. The harrow was collected the following weekend, transported on Frank's wagon with Abraham pulling gamely, and Opal rode along because she wanted to see her childhood home, and because she wanted her father to see her and Frank together in the daylight of an ordinary situation, not the heightened circumstances of confrontations and formal reconciliations, but the simple fact of them as a working unit. The visit to the Doyle Ranch was the first time Opal had been back since October, and it was stranger and more emotional than she had prepared for. The house was the same and not the same, the way places were when you had left them under difficult circumstances. Hector showed them the equipment shed with the particular pride of a man showing his operation to someone whose assessment he now, however reluctantly, respected. He also showed Frank the section of the range where he had been experimenting with drought-resistant grass varieties, which was something Frank had been thinking about too, and this produced a conversation that was genuinely energetic, and that Opal listened to from her position near the kitchen garden fence with a feeling that was approaching happiness, if not quite there yet. She found, while the men were absorbed in their conversation, that she walked to the corner of the yard where her mother's roses were, 3 bushes that had survived the years through sheer determination and Opal's own care during the years she had lived there. They had been cut back for winter and were just sticks now, but they were alive, and she crouched in front of them and put her hand on the cold, dry soil around them and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time. She was coming back to this place, but differently. Not as a daughter constrained by her father's vision of who she should be, but as a woman with her own life and her own choices who could love her father from the position of herself, rather than from the position of someone managed and arranged. That was a better arrangement for everyone, she thought, though it had taken the kind of confrontation that she would not have chosen to arrive at it. December came, and with it the first genuine snow. It came in the night, the kind of quiet snowfall that arrives without announcement and transforms everything by morning into a soft, white reimagining of itself. Opal woke first and went to the window and looked out at the changed world, the creek invisible under its white covering, the scrub oaks carrying improbable white burdens on every branch, the cleared field a clean, unmarked surface that looked, she thought, genuinely full of promise. Frank woke a few minutes later and found her at the window and came to stand behind her with his arms around her and his chin resting lightly on the top of her head, and they looked at the snow together. "How is the stove?" she asked. "I will get it built up," he said, "but look at it first." She looked. The snow was still coming down lightly, unhurried, the kind of snow that knew it had arrived and was not in any rush. The whole of their small property was softened by it, the awkward angles and the rough surfaces gentled into something that looked almost elegant. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is," he agreed. He went to build up the fire and she put on her coat over her nightdress and went to the door and opened it, and stood in the threshold looking out at the snow with the cold sharp in her lungs and something warm and enormous in her chest. The winter that her father came around before, the winter that her husband had promised to make livable, and had done so through sheer conscientious effort, the winter that had arrived with its cold and its snow and its forcing of every creature to be deliberate about warmth and shelter. This winter felt, standing in the doorway of the cabin that listed slightly to the left, and was now entirely her home, like the beginning of something rather than the middle or the end. Hector Doyle arrived unannounced on a Sunday morning in mid-December, which was unusual enough to bring both Frank and Opal to the door quickly. He came on horseback this time alone, and he was carrying something across his saddle, a bundle wrapped in cloth. He dismounted and tied his horse and came to the door, and Opal saw, when he was close enough, that his expression had the particular quality of a man engaged in doing something he would not find easy. He held out the bundle. Opal took it and unwrapped it and found her mother's recipe book, a small leather-bound volume that Margaret Doyle had maintained throughout her married life, her handwriting filling it in neat and faded rows. Opal had left it behind in October without meaning to, and she had thought about it on several occasions since, the specific ache of an absence. She looked at her father. "Your mother would have wanted you to have it," Hector said. "She would have wanted you to have it and to use it and to keep it going whatever house you were in." He paused. "I have been remiss." Opal pressed the book against her chest. "Come in, Papa," she said. "Frank has coffee on and I am going to make biscuits." She made the biscuits from her mother's recipe, which she knew by heart anyway, but found herself consulting the book for the pleasure of seeing her mother's handwriting direct her. Hector and Frank sat at the table and began talking, this time without the formality of an agenda, just the easy-ranging conversation of 2 men who were finding their way toward a kind of respect. Frank told Hector about his plan for the spring planting, more ambitious now with the springtooth harrow available to him, and Hector listened and offered a specific piece of advice about the south-facing section's drainage that Frank wrote down in his planning notebook. Hector told Frank about a water source, a small spring on the eastern edge of Frank's property that Frank had not fully investigated, that might prove useful. "You have a spring," Opal asked Frank from the stove. I had been aware of it as a feature, Frank said. I did not know it was reliable year-round. It was reliable when that land was part of Callaway's original grant, Hector said. I remember it from when I was new to this country. It ran clear in the summer of '68, which was one of the driest years I can remember. The biscuits came out of the pan on the stove, golden and smelling of everything that kitchen warmth and a good recipe could produce. And the three of them ate together at the rough table with the snow visible through the window and the stove throwing good heat. And the conversation that ran through lunch was not the conversation of a reconciliation, but the conversation of something better, ordinary life proceeding. Hector stayed until the early afternoon. When he left, he paused at the door and looked at Frank with the expression of a man making a final assessment and finding the result satisfactory, not in a grand or theatrical way, but in the quiet way of a man whose standards were high and whose acknowledgment, when it came, meant something. You are doing right by her, Hector said. Frank met his eyes. I intend to keep doing so. Hector nodded. He put on his coat. At the door he paused one more time and looked at Opal. Come to Christmas dinner, he said. Both of you. I will have Denny and his wife and the Weeks family if they will come, and it would be better with you there. It was the closest thing to an apology and an invitation and an acknowledgment all at once that Hector Doyle was capable of producing, and Opal received it as exactly what it was. We will be there, Papa, she said. After he left, she and Frank stood at the window and watched his horse disappear up the creek road, and she felt Frank take her hand. He is going to be all right, she said. He already is mostly, Frank said. He just needed the time to see it for himself. She turned and looked at her husband in the winter light of their cabin, the man she had run to, the man she had chosen with her eyes open and her heart fully committed, and she thought about all the things she knew about him now that she had not known in October. The way he read to himself in the evenings with an expression of genuine engagement, occasionally stopping to read a passage aloud to her because he thought she would find it interesting, and he was usually right. The way he handled Abraham with patience and the occasional firm word, and a consistency that the mule had clearly learned to trust. The way he was always the first to be cold and the last to say so, because he was still, under the careful practicality, a man who would rather be uncomfortable himself than ask anyone else to be. She knew that she had made the right choice on that October morning. She had known it on the creek road, and she had known it at the church, and she had known it in the various hard and quiet and tender moments that followed. But knowing it now, in December, with the snow on the ground and her father riding away from them in peace, felt different from the earlier knowings. It felt complete. It felt like the kind of certainty you could build a life on without fearing that the ground would shift. Christmas arrived and they went to the Doyle Ranch. Clara and Thomas Weeks came, and Denny Marsh and his wife Ada, and the house that Opal had grown up in was full of people and firelight, and the particular warmth that comes from a gathering where the conflicts have been worked through, and what remains is the genuine good feeling of people who have chosen to be in the same place together. Hector had killed a goose, and Opal helped Ada prepare it in her mother's kitchen, using her mother's recipe book, and the kitchen smelled of everything rich and good, and the afternoon light came in low through the west-facing windows and lay across the floor in long golden strips that she found she wanted to stand in and did. After dinner, when the men were around Hector's fire talking and the women were at the table with coffee and the Weeks children were doing something adventurous in the hallway that nobody was investigating too carefully, Clara took Opal's hand under the table and said quietly, "You look different." "Different how?" Opal asked. "You look like yourself," Clara said. "The version of yourself that was always there but that had to work very hard to be visible." Opal thought about this. "I think that is probably right," she said. "I think that is probably exactly right." Across the room, Frank was listening to her father describe something about water management, and she watched Frank listen, that attentive, fully present listening, and she watched her father talking, That particular aliveness that Hector had when he was in conversation with someone he had decided was worth the full engagement of his intelligence, and she thought, they are going to be fine. These two men who came at each other so hard in October are going to be fine. Frank caught her looking at him from across the room, and the look he gave back was the one she had come to think of as specifically hers, the one he kept back until he meant it, and she held it for a moment, and then looked away because some things were too warm to look at directly. The new year came in quietly. January was cold, and the snow came twice more, and each time it transformed the 15 acres into the clean white thing that Opal had begun to associate with possibility. They spent the cold weeks in the cabin's warmth planning for spring with the practical intimacy of two people who had learned to share a small space well, their papers spread on the table, the account book open, the planning notebook filling with Frank's careful writing. Frank had made contact, through Thomas Weeks, who had a wide network of business acquaintances, with a seed supplier in San Antonio who offered spring varieties at significantly better prices than the local store, and the order they put together over 2 evenings in January, referencing Hector's advice and Frank's own studied knowledge of the soil conditions in the cleared section, was the most ambitious thing Frank had yet attempted on the property. He showed it to Hector on a Sunday visit in late January, and Hector looked it over with the care of a man who took agricultural planning seriously, and he made 2 specific suggestions that Frank incorporated, and then he looked up and said, "You are going to need a hand for the planting season." "I know it," Frank said. "I have been thinking about it." "I have a man coming off my payroll in March," Hector said. "Young fellow named Will Torres, good worker. He is leaving because I cannot expand my operation enough to keep all the hands I have, and he needs steadier work. He might suit you if you can cover his wages." Frank looked at the numbers. "If the spring planting goes as projected, I can cover wages from July through the end of the season. The months before that would be difficult." Hector was quiet for a moment. "I will pay him for March and April," he said. "Consider it an investment in the operation." Frank looked at him. "That is a significant thing to offer." "I am not offering it for nothing," Hector said. "I expect to see a return in the form of a working farm that my daughter is not going to have to worry about 10 years from now." Frank held his gaze. "That is a fair arrangement." They shook hands on it, across the rough table in the cabin on the creek road, 2 men who had come a considerable distance from the confrontation in October, and who were now, in the way that people with genuine quality eventually found their way to each other, allies of a kind that had not been possible when they first met. Opal, who had been listening from the stove where she was heating water for coffee, turned away and looked at the wall for a moment and breathed carefully because she was not going to weep in front of either of them, but it was a near thing. February came, and then March, and Will Torres arrived as promised, a young man of 20 who was cheerful and hardworking, and who had the particular gift of knowing when to be present, and when to be usefully invisible, which made him excellent company for a young couple still finding the shape of their shared life. The spring planting was everything Frank had planned, and some things he had not. The spring the Hector had mentioned turned out to be reliable, and positioned well enough that Frank was able to run a channel to the garden section without enormous effort, and this changed the water situation for the planting season in a way that made several things possible that had previously been marginal. The cleared section took the seed well, and the soil, Frank's years of careful work at it beginning to pay their compound interest, responded with the kind of early growth that made a man want to walk out into it every morning just to see it. Opal had been watching something about herself with interest since January, and by late February, she had the kind of certainty about it that required a conversation. She told Frank on a Saturday morning in early March over coffee, the way she told him everything, directly and clearly. She was going to have a baby. She was, as far as she could determine, 3 months along, which placed the beginning of things in December, which made her smile when she thought about the timing of it. Frank received this information with a stillness that she had learned to read correctly, which was not the stillness of shock or displeasure, but the stillness of a man who was taking in something very large and making sure he understood all its dimensions before he responded to it. Then the stillness broke into something that was unmistakably and completely joy, uncomplicated and enormous, and he stood up from the table and came around it and held her with the careful, encompassing care of a man who understood that he was holding more than one person. "A baby," he said into her hair. "Opal." "Yes," she said. "Sometime in September, I think." He pulled back and looked at her face with that particular look, the one that was specifically hers. "Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," she said. "I am tremendously well. I wanted to be sure before I told you." "We need to tell your father," he said immediately. She laughed. "Yes, we will tell Papa." Hector Doyle, when told, managed his reaction with somewhat less composure than Frank had. He had been at the cabin for his Sunday visit, and Opal told him over coffee, and he set down his cup very carefully and looked at his daughter, and then at Frank and then back at his daughter. And then his face did the thing it had done outside the church at her christening, a long time ago. A thing she had seen in a tintype her mother had kept. A fullness and an overwhelm that was the emotion he carried when it was too large to contain behind the usual management. "A child," he said. "Your grandchild," Opal said, "due in September." Hector stood up and went to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to them. When he turned around, his face was composed again, but his eyes were very bright. "Good," he said to Frank. "You will need the cabin properly expanded before September. It is not large enough for 3. "I was thinking the same thing," Frank said. "I have lumber in the back lot," Hector said. "Seasoned white pine, more than I currently need. I will send it down with Denny next week." "That is too much," Frank began. "It is a grandchild," Hector said, in the tone of a man who has identified a category of investment that supersedes normal financial calculation. "Take the lumber." Frank looked at Opal. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who was enjoying watching her father and her husband find each other in real time. "Thank you," Frank said to Hector. "I will put it to good use." The expansion of the cabin was undertaken through April and into May with Frank, and Will Torres doing the primary work and Hector appearing on 3 separate Saturdays to participate in the heavier lifting, with an energy that suggested he was genuinely glad of the physical labor. Perhaps as a form of the apology he had said more directly in November, and was now saying in the language of work. The new room was added along the east wall, taking advantage of the morning sun, large enough for a proper bed and a small dresser, and the cradle that Opal had mentioned wanting, and that Frank built himself over 2 evenings in the shop area of the shed, working with the careful attention to detail that he brought to everything that mattered. Spring turned to summer, and the planting Frank had done in March was coming in with the gratifying abundance of a well-planned operation that had received the rain it needed at the intervals it needed, which in West Texas was never guaranteed and always cause for genuine gratitude when it occurred. The garden was full and productive, far beyond what they could eat, and Opal found herself preserving and putting up with a thoroughness that pleased her in its practical satisfaction. The root cellar that Frank had dug in the spring was filling in the way a good root cellar was supposed to fill, and there was something about that filling, the jars on the shelves, the laid-in provisions against the coming winter, that felt like the opposite of scarcity in the most fundamental way. Frank sold the first real surplus from the cleared section at the Millhaven market in late July, a modest but real quantity of corn and dry beans that went for prices that were not spectacular but that were honest, and he came home with the money in his coat pocket and put it on the table and looked at it with an expression that contained several years of difficult mornings. "You believed in this land," Opal said. "I believed in it partly," he said. "You believed in me, and that made it easier to keep believing in the land." She stood behind him and put her arms around him from behind and rested her head against his shoulder, and they looked at the money on the table together. It was not a fortune. It was not going to transform the circumstances of the 15 acres overnight. But it was real and it was earned, and it meant that the thing Frank Hudson had come to West Texas to prove was, stone by careful stone, and season by determined season, being proved. August was hot, as August always was, and Opal was large with the baby and moved through the days with the particular combination of contentment and discomfort that distinguished the last weeks of pregnancy. Frank was attentive without being hovering, which she appreciated, bringing her water and making sure she was not overexerting herself without making a project of her comfort that would have felt patronizing. Clara came often, which was a genuine gift, and she and Opal sat in the evenings in front of the cabin in the cooling air of late August and talked about everything, the baby and the season and the valley, and the various small dramas of Millhaven life, including the notable recent intelligence that Garrett Sinclair was in significant legal difficulty relating to the circumstances of his first wife's death. An investigation that the new county sheriff had opened in July, following the testimony of a former ranch hand who had left the area, and then written a letter to the sheriff's office from his new location in Colorado. Opal received this information without satisfaction, which was the honest truth of it. She had no desire for harm to come to anyone, even a man who had tried to have her marriage voided. But she was aware that whatever happened, it removed the last shadow of that particular threat from her life and from Frank's, and the removal of a shadow was something she could accept with simple practical relief. The baby came in the first week of September, as expected, in the bed in the new room with Clara and the midwife Mrs. Hartwell in attendance and Frank in the main room of the cabin doing the thing men did in that era, which was be available and be close and try to be useful without being in the way. Hector Doyle was, by some instinct or some word from Clara's husband, at the Creek Road property before it was over and was sitting in the yard with Frank when Mrs. Hartwell came to the door. It was a boy. A boy who arrived already demonstrating the particular committed aliveness of a person who intended to be here and was going to do so with considerable volume and determination. He was healthy and complete, and he had Frank's dark hair and Opal's particular expression of evaluating everything around him with focused, intelligent attention. And when he was placed in Frank's arms in the new room with Opal watching from the bed and Hector standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, the four of them were the first gathering of a family that was going to be real and lasting and full. Frank looked at his son, and then at his wife with an expression that was beyond his usual vocabulary, beyond the careful, honest speech he relied on, something deeper than words and more encompassing. He brought the boy to Opal and placed him carefully in her arms and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and the three of them were there together in the morning light of September. Hector cleared his throat from the doorway. "What are you going to call him?" Frank looked at Opal. They had talked about names in the evenings during August, and they had arrived without drama at the one that felt right. "Henry," Opal said. "For my grandfather." She looked at her father. "If that suits you, Papa." Hector's jaw worked briefly. He looked at the ceiling of the new room and then back at his daughter and grandson with an expression that was several things at once, all of them real. "Henry," he said. "That suits very well." He came into the room and stood beside the bed and looked at the baby with the careful attention of a man meeting someone important for the first time. And then, slowly, with the deliberate tenderness of a man who had spent a great many years being careful about where he placed his tenderness, he reached out and touched the baby's hand with one rough, weathered finger, and the baby, in the way of new babies doing things that seem to mean more than they possibly can, curled his small fingers around Hector's and held on. The valley went into autumn, and the first frost came in October, and the scrub oaks turned golden along the creek road, and the baby grew and was healthy and loud and interested in everything. Hector came every Sunday without exception, which had become the established fact of their weeks. He had developed a habit of sitting with Henry in the new room while Opal rested and Frank worked, and the two of them conducted what appeared, from the sounds that came from the room, to be serious, ongoing conversations about the world. Frank's operation had continued to build through the remainder of the year. Will Torres had stayed on past the season, because there was enough work, and because he had settled into the life of the place, and the three of them worked well together. The plan Frank had when he bought the 15 acres, the long plan that he had explained to Opal one evening by the creek before they were married with great earnestness and some embarrassment, was proceeding according to something close to its original intention, which was itself close to a miracle in the reality of West Texas farming. The small dairy operation was a real possibility for the following spring. Hector had suggested a man in the valley who bred good milk stock and who might deal fairly on a second cow. Frank had been out to see the man and come back with a plan and a handshake agreement that would come into effect in February. On a Sunday afternoon in November, exactly 1 year after Hector's first visit to the cabin on the creek road, they were all at the table together, Hector and Frank and Opal with Henry in his cradle nearby. And they were having the kind of conversation that required no particular occasion and produced no particular conclusion, but that was simply the sound of people who trusted each other talking about the things that mattered to them. Frank said at some point, looking around the table, "I want to say something." Everyone was quiet. "I want to say that I know what I have," he said. "I knew when I bought this land that there were no guarantees about what it would amount to. I knew when Opal walked down the creek road that October morning that what she was bringing to my door was larger than anything I had been able to offer in return, and that the only answer to that was to be the truest and most dedicated version of myself that I was capable of being." He looked at Opal. "I am still working on that. I expect I will be working on it for a long time, but I want to say, with you here and you here," he looked at Hector, "that I understand what I have been given and I do not intend to waste a day of it." The room was quiet. Hector Doyle looked at his son-in-law across the rough table in the cabin on the creek road, the cabin that no longer listed to one side because Frank had spent a week in August repairing the foundation. He looked at him with the expression of a man who had done the hard internal work of revising his judgments and had arrived, through that work, at something true. "You have not wasted a day of it yet," Hector said. Henry made a sound from his cradle that was either agreement or hunger and probably both, and Opal laughed and went to pick up her son. And the afternoon continued around the table, with the warmth of the stove and the cold of the November world outside, and the particular quality of peace that settles over people who have come through something difficult together, and arrived at the other side of it changed for the better. Later that evening, after Hector had ridden home in the early dark, and Will Torres had gone to his bunk in the shed and Henry was asleep, Frank and Opal sat together by the stove in the way they had sat since October of the year before, his arm around her and her head against his shoulder, and the fire made its sounds and the night made its sounds, and between those two things there was the quiet of people who were fully at home. "Are you happy?" Frank asked. He asked it with the directness he brought to everything, not as a polite question, but as a real one. Opal considered it the way she had learned he wanted her to consider things, honestly and without the impulse to give the answer that was expected rather than the answer that was true. "Yes," she said, "not because everything is easy or because everything has worked out perfectly, but because this is real and it is ours and you are exactly who you are and I chose it, all of it. I would choose it again tomorrow." Frank was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub oaks along the creek road, the same wind, the same trees, the same cold and dark that had been there when she first walked down that road with her carpetbag, and the determination of a woman who was done being arranged. "I would have been wasting my life," he said, "if you had not walked down that road." She turned to look at him and found the look that was hers, steady and full, and belonging to her in the way that some things simply belong to a person. "Then it is a good thing," she said, "that I walked." He kissed her, and the fire burned, and the baby slept in the new room, and outside the frost was building on the creek road and the scrub oaks were bare now against the winter sky, and everything that mattered was inside, warm and certain and whole. The following spring brought the second cow, a fine producer named Ruth who integrated herself into the rhythm of the property with minimal drama. The dairy operation proved, over the subsequent months, to be exactly what Frank had calculated it could be. A steady, modest income that supplemented the farming and began to accumulate in the account book in a way that felt like a foundation being laid under something real. Hector Doyle, for his part, found that his Sunday visits to the cabin on the creek road had become the part of his week he most looked forward to, which was information that surprised him when he registered it. He had expected to tolerate the visits, to perform the role of reconciled father without necessarily enjoying it. What he had not expected was that the conversations at Frank's table were often the most interesting conversations of his week, that Frank Hudson was a man whose thinking he genuinely respected, that watching Henry grow was providing him with something he had not known he was missing, and that sitting across from his daughter in the life she had built herself was, in some way he could not fully articulate, allowing him to see her clearly for the first time. By the following October, exactly 2 years after the harvest social where it had all begun, Frank Hudson's 15 acres were producing enough to be called a real operation. Not large, not spectacular, but real and solvent and growing in the methodical way of something built correctly from the ground up. The cabin had been properly expanded. The spring was channeled to serve the garden and the dairy animals. The cleared section was in its 3rd year of production, and the soil was noticeably responding to 3 years of care. There were plans on the table, literal plans on paper on the actual table, for a second expansion of the cleared ground that would, if they proceeded, bring the cultivated acreage to something that could honestly be called a small farm rather than a large garden. Opal was expecting their second child, which was information she had delivered to Frank in September with the same directness and the same private delight as the first time. This one would come in late spring, which was good timing if you were thinking about the planting schedule, though she had not led with that argument. Henry, now just past his first birthday, was conducting himself with the particular purposeful intensity of a child who had recently discovered walking and was applying it to all available problems. He was a social creature who had inherited his grandfather's directness and his father's patience and his mother's attention to things, and he had recently developed a deep interest in Abraham the mule that the mule appeared to reciprocate with equine benevolence. Clara and Thomas Weeks had become genuinely close friends to both Frank and Opal in the way that friendships develop between people who have been present for the important things and have proven their quality through presence and through loyalty. Clara had been at the birth of Henry and would be at the birth of the next child, and this was simply understood between them. The second child was a girl, born in late May of that year, and they named her Margaret for Opal's mother, and Hector Doyle's composure failed entirely and completely when Opal told him the name, which she found she did not mind at all. By the time the second October snow came to the Rio Bravo Valley, the family that had started with an act of courage on a frost-stiffened morning on the creek road was something that could fill a room and warm it with the sheer fact of its existence. Hector Doyle, who had come to the cabin that autumn with his hat in his hands and an apology he had had to work hard to make, had been transformed by the years since into something he had not known he was capable of being. A grandfather, in the full and present sense of that word, a man who sat on the ground with Henry and showed him how to hold a piece of rope, and who carried Margaret with the careful particular tenderness of someone who understood that second chances were rare and ought to be used completely. Frank Hudson, who had come from Missouri with 15 rocky acres and a plan, and the deep-seated refusal to believe that the fixed circumstances of a person's origin were the final word on the possibilities of their life, had done what he had promised in his quiet, deliberate way, not overnight and not without difficulty, but without a single wasted morning. The farm was real now. The family was real. The life they had built together in the cabin that no longer listed to one side was real in every dimension. And Opal, who had walked down the creek road on a cold October morning with a carpet bag and the knowledge of what she was doing and the commitment to do it anyway, who had stood in the doorway of a humble cabin and said, "Let us go find Reverend Calloway," who had kept her composure through her father's anger and Sinclair's legal maneuvering and the genuine difficulty of the first winter and every difficulty that followed. Opal was exactly where she had intended to be when she took that first step away from everything she had been given and toward everything she had chosen. She sat on the step of the cabin one evening in late October, the children inside with Frank, the evening air carrying the first cold edge of the coming season, the scrub oaks bare along the creek road, the sky the deep blue of a clear night beginning. The same sky it had always been, the same creek road, the same exact place. But the person sitting in it was fully herself in a way that the person who had run down this road 2 years ago was only beginning to be. She heard Frank come to the door behind her and felt him sit down beside her on the step, his shoulder warm against hers. "Henry is asleep," he said. "Margaret is attempting to stay awake through determination alone. She has your stubbornness. She has my clarity of purpose," Opal corrected. Frank smiled. She could feel it more than see it. "There is apparently a word for the kind of love I have for you," he said. "I have been reading and I think the word is devotion. Everything else I have tried feels like it leaves something out." She leaned her head against his shoulder the way she had learned to lean in the particular space where his shoulder met the warmth of his neck, the space that seemed designed specifically for her head and nowhere else. "Devotion," she said. "Yes, that sounds about right." Above them the first stars appeared in the darkening Texas sky, and the night settled around the cabin and the farm and the family inside it, and everything that had been built from a choice, and a walk down a creek road was solid and warm and permanent beneath it. Nothing was left unresolved. Nothing was left uncertain. The father had come around before the winter, as he had, and the winter had come and gone and come again, and everything had been made whole. And the morning after that particular evening, Frank woke before dawn as he always did and went out in the cold to tend to the animals, and the morning star was still visible in the west, and the property that had been 15 rocky acres of nothing much was producing visible breath in the cold air in the way of a living thing. And Frank Hudson stood in the yard of his farm, and his home, and his life and felt, as he had felt every morning for 2 years with a constancy that had not diminished, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He always went back inside before the household woke. He always put the coffee on and built up the fire and stood in the warm cabin with the familiar sounds of his family beginning to stir around him. And every morning without exception, before the routine of the day took hold, he allowed himself the full weight of gratitude for the woman who had walked down the creek road to him. Not because she had needed rescuing, she had not. She had rescued herself through the clarity of her own choice. But because she had chosen him, specifically and deliberately and with her eyes entirely open, and that was the kind of gift a man could spend a whole life being worthy of and never fully repay. And Frank Hudson had every intention of spending that whole life trying, which was, when you reduced it to its simplest form, the whole of the story, and also the beginning of everything that came after.